It all began as it always did, with an invasion. An invasion unceremonious and cold, yet wrapped in expensive packaging. This particular incursion arrived in the form of a flat, rectangular parcel of thick, cream-colored cardstock, delivered by a courier with an impassive face. He didn't smile, only confirmed the surname dryly, and held out an electronic terminal for her signature. Eleanor signed with the stylus, feeling the plastic tip glide across the glass. Another soulless ritual in a chain of events that had already begun to unfold without her consent. The door clicked shut, sealing off the noise of the stairwell, and she was left alone in the silence of her apartment, holding this artifact from another world. The package was heavy, substantial. Inside lay a single card. It was made of such a thick, almost velvety cardstock that it felt more like a thin ivory tile than a piece of paper. The edges were finished with gold embossing, and a faint, complex scent hung in the air. A mixture of expensive perfume and the highest quality printing ink. It was the scent of money, of status, and of the unwavering confidence that the world revolved around you. The scent of her family, in an exquisite calligraphic script that Eleanor would have recognized anywhere. It had been designed for their family by a famous artist for a sum that, in their minds, equaled her annual salary, were the words, "Robert and Eleanor Thompson have the honor of inviting you to celebrate the 65th birthday of the head of the family. The festivities will be held at the restaurant La Toile d'Or." Eleanor let out a short, mirthless laugh. Have the honor? What an irony. Her family had never considered her presence anywhere an honor. It was a chore, a social obligation. A box to be ticked on a list to maintain the facade of a perfect family in front of their circle. La Toile d'Or. The Golden Star. The name had thundered through the city 6 months ago when the restaurant, like a comet, had streaked across the gastronomic sky to claim its 3rd Michelin star. A place with a waiting list 8 months long. A place where the bill for one person, without wine, could cover the rent on her humble apartment for several months. She placed the invitation on the massive oak table that served as both her workspace and her dining area. It lay there, alien and garish, next to a well-worn volume of Proust and a stack of financial reports on restaurant chains. Eleanor ran her fingers along the spines of the books. Here, in her sanctuary, her fortress built of silence, books, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee, she was safe. The walls of her apartment were not adorned with the ostentatious modern art her mother bought at auctions, only to mention it casually in high society conversation. Instead, a few watercolors by an unknown street artist hung alongside black and white photographs of the old city that she had taken herself. Here, everything was real, authentic. Unlike the world from which this invitation had come, the memory washed over her, an unwelcome tide. A family dinner 10 years ago. She was 22 then, having just graduated from university with top honors in economics. Her family had already planned her future. A prestigious law school, then a position at Vanessa's firm or, even better, in the financial company of one of her father's friends. Everything was decided. And then, over dessert, as her father contentedly lit a cigar, she had gathered her courage and said, "I'm not going to law school. I want to be a journalist. I want to write." The silence that fell over the table then was deafening. Her father slowly lowered his cigar. His face, usually ruddy and good-natured, turned a deep shade of crimson. "A journalist?" he thundered, his voice laced with steel. "You want to dig in the dirt for pennies? Journalism isn't a profession. It's a hobby for the daughters of rich husbands who have nothing better to do. I didn't raise you to be someone's hobby." Her mother, pale, clutched the string of pearls at her neck. "Ellie, darling," she stammered. "But that's so unstable. Unseemly. What will people say?" And Vanessa, her perfect older sister, already beginning her brilliant legal career, had looked at her with a mixture of pity and superiority. "Don't be a child, Ellie. The world doesn't work that way. You have to build a career, not chase fantasies." That night, she had become a disappointment to them. A lost investment. From then on, they treated her like an ailing relative one visits out of a sense of duty, with a sympathy laced with irritation. They were convinced she worked for some third-rate city paper called the Urban Herald, a name she had once invented just to end their questioning. They imagined her writing articles about lost kittens and the opening of a new bakery, earning mere pennies for her efforts. This fictional life they had crafted for her gave them the right to look down on her, to pity her, and to feel their own superiority. And Eleanor never corrected them. It was her defense. Her invisible armor. The sharp, demanding ring of the telephone cut through the quiet. She didn't need to look at the screen. She knew who it was. Only one person in her contacts list had the ability to call at the precise moment her emotional equilibrium was most fragile. She ran a hand over her face, took a deep breath, and answered, putting the call on speaker. "Ellie, did you get it?" Vanessa's voice was exactly as she remembered, bright, confident, and soaked in condescension like a fine sponge cake in brandy. "Yes, Vanessa. Just now," Eleanor replied, her voice even, almost colorless. "Excellent. Listen, I'm calling to give you a heads up. Dad insisted you come. You know it's his big birthday, he wants the whole family together." The invisible air quotes in her sister's voice emphasized the theatricality of the moment. "So please make an effort. Try to look presentable. None of your stretched-out sweaters and worn-out boots. This is L'Etoile d'Or, not your newsroom." Eleanor glanced down at her hand. On her finger was a ring. A thin band of white gold with a tiny, almost imperceptible sapphire. It was nothing like Vanessa's enormous diamonds. She had bought this ring for herself with the first fee she had earned under the pseudonym, Ethel. A fee that was 3 times Vanessa's monthly salary at her prestigious firm. "I'll try not to disgrace the family name," Eleanor said dryly. "Good girl," Vanessa continued in her mentoring tone, missing the irony completely. "And one more thing. Don't worry about the bill. Gavin and I will cover it. So you don't have to sit there with a single salad all evening. You can order something hot. Consider it our treat." The offer was tossed out with such casual generosity that it momentarily took Eleanor's breath away. She pictured Vanessa's face if she knew that a few days ago, Eleanor had transferred a sum sufficient to buy Gavin's car into her brokerage account. Money earned from a single article. "Thank you, Vanessa. That's very kind of you," she said, and the words tasted like ash. "Yes, I know. And lastly, please try not to sit there with that little notebook of yours all evening. It looks strange. People will think you're spying or something. Just relax and try to be normal. At least for one night. For Dad's sake. Be normal." For them, that meant talking about real estate, stocks, and vacation plans in the Maldives. For them, it meant measuring success by the size of one's bank account and the number of influential acquaintances. Eleanor looked again at the invitation. L'Etoile d'Or. She had been there last week. Incognito, at a table in the corner. She already knew that their halibut was magnificent, but the sauce for the scallops was a touch too acidic, and the young waiter was nervous and prone to dropping forks. She knew that Chef Antoine Lefebvre was a genius on the verge of a nervous breakdown. She knew more about the restaurant than her entire family combined, because that was her job. Her real job. "I hear you, Vanessa. Thanks for the concern. I have to go." "Right, of course. Run along to your little rag," Vanessa threw back as a parting shot, a note of boredom creeping into her voice. "See you on Saturday. And don't be late." The line went dead. Eleanor sat in the silence for several more minutes. The familiar cold knot churned in her chest. A mixture of resentment, anger, and a deep, chronic sorrow. Why did she still agree to this? Why did she subject herself to this performance every time? Where she was cast in the role of the poor relation. Perhaps, deep down, a foolish, childish hope still flickered that one day they would see her. Not her bank account, not her status, but just her. Or maybe she was simply a masochist. Or, and this thought brought with it a sliver of comfort, she was a researcher. An anthropologist studying the strange, exotic tribe of her own family. She was gathering material. Not for an article. For herself. She stood and walked to the window. The evening city was beginning to light up. Down below, life teemed, full of millions of stories. And she was one of those who told these stories. She was Ethel. The critic whose word was feared by the most celebrated chefs. The woman who had built her empire on a sharp mind, an impeccable palate, and absolute anonymity. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass. A young woman with serious eyes looked back at her. Not Ellie the failure. Not the poor relation. But a queen in her own secret kingdom. And on Saturday, this queen would go to the ball at her parents' castle. But they wouldn't know it. Not yet. She would put on her best mask, the mask of humility and modesty, and she would watch. For the best critic is, above all, the best observer. And the performance promised to be utterly fascinating. The silence that followed Vanessa's call was dense and heavy, like the velvet curtain of an old theater. Eleanor stood motionless in the middle of her living room as the echoes of her sister's words, "Presentable. We'll cover it. Little notebook. Be normal," slowly settled like dust on every surface of her carefully constructed world. Each word was a small, sharpened stiletto, aimed not so much to wound as to remind her of her place in their family hierarchy. At the very bottom, on the stool reserved for misbehaving children, she exhaled slowly, shaking off the torpor. The first thing she needed to do was ground herself. She walked barefoot across the cool wooden floor to her bookshelf, which spanned the entire wall from floor to ceiling. This was her citadel, her arsenal. She traced the spines of the books with her fingertips. They weren't just novels and poetry, but thick tomes on the history of cuisine, the chemistry of taste, the economics of the restaurant business, and biographies of great chefs. These were her tools, her teachers, her companions on long nights when the rest of the world slept and she worked. Her family thought she read sentimental novels. They wouldn't have understood a single title on these shelves. Her gaze fell upon the massive oak table that was the heart of the apartment. A state of organized chaos reigned there. On the left, a stack of perfectly sharpened pencils and several moleskine notebooks in different colors, each for a different type of establishment. Black for fine dining, red for bistros and gastropubs, blue for exotic and ethnic restaurants. On the right, her laptop, thin and silver like a blade. It was open. Eleanor sat down at the table, and the world outside her apartment ceased to exist. Here, she was not Ellie, not the younger sister, not an object of pity. Here she was Ethel. She put on her thin-framed glasses and pulled the laptop closer. The screen glowed with a nearly finished text. It was a scathing review of the new restaurant group, Vogue Gastronomy, which had opened 3 establishments in the city center with incredible pomp, investing millions in interiors by fashionable designers and aggressive marketing. Eleanor had visited all 3. Incognito, of course. She had paid the bills with her personal card, registered under a fictitious name, one of several she kept for such purposes. She reread her own words, detached, like a surgeon examining the line of an incision. Vogue Gastronomy is a triumph of form over substance, a victory of Instagram over taste. Their dishes are, without a doubt, photogenic. They are like hollow, beautiful people at a high society party. Pleasant to look at, but after 5 minutes of conversation, you realize that behind the flawless facade lies a deafening void. The tuna tartare, served on a slab of Himalayan salt, is more concerned with its geological presentation than the freshness of the fish. The truffle risotto smells not of earth and forest, but of the cheap synthetic oil that is generously drizzled over it to justify its exorbitant price. This is not food. This is a prop for social media. She frowned, deleted the last sentence, and typed a new one. This is a culinary simulacrum, meticulously constructed for an era in which appearing is more important than being. Yes. That was better. Sharper. More precise. She knew what would happen tomorrow morning when this article was published on the website of The Gavel, the most influential and anonymous online publication on gastronomy, which she herself had founded 5 years ago. The shares of Vogue Gastronomy would plummet. Reservations would be cancelled. The powerful investors who had put their money into this bubble would start asking uncomfortable questions. Her words had weight. Real, measurable financial weight. And therein lay the essence of her power, her responsibility, and her curse. She leaned back in her chair. She hadn't chosen the pseudonym Ethel by chance. It was her great-grandmother's name. A woman of iron character who had single-handedly managed a small farm and baked the best bread in the county. She was the embodiment of authenticity, hard work, and honesty. Everything that was so lacking in the glossy world of her parents. Anonymity, meanwhile, was not a whim but a necessity. It was her ethical code. Eleanor knew what would happen if her identity were revealed. Complimentary dinners. Fawning smiles from chefs. Invitations to private tastings. Temptation. Her judgments would cease to be pure. Every compliment would be poisoned by the suspicion of a bribe. Every criticism an accusation of personal dislike. Anonymity was her sterile operating theater. It allowed her to judge the dish, not the person who prepared it. It protected her from the greatest danger for a critic, becoming part of the very system she was meant to evaluate. And of course, it protected her from her family. She couldn't imagine the horror of a situation where her father, meeting the owner of a restaurant she had given a low rating to on the golf course, would start apologizing for his difficult daughter. Or worse, try to use her influence for his own purposes. No. Ethel was her secret, her power, her freedom. With this thought, she stood and walked to her closet. This was another area of her life that her family pictured completely wrong. They surely imagined a wardrobe crammed with cheap, fast-fashion clothes. In reality, the closet was almost Spartan. No more than 24 items hung there. But each one was a piece of perfection. A cashmere sweater that felt like a cloud against the skin. Perfectly tailored trousers of fine wool. A trench coat of waterproof gabardine that would last her a lifetime. Eleanor didn't chase fashion. She invested in quality and timeless style. Her hand glided over the hangers, searching for the right armor for the upcoming battle. Her eyes settled on a dress. At first glance, it was the epitome of simplicity. Black knee-length, with long sleeves and a modest boat neckline. No embellishments, no details for the eye to catch on. Vanessa would have called it boring or funereal. But Eleanor knew its secret. It had been made by Helene Dubois, a brilliant and almost reclusive Parisian designer, who despised logos and trends. Her philosophy was one of intellectual fashion, of clothing for oneself, not for others. The dress was made from the heaviest, densest silk crepe one could find. The fabric flowed and moved with the body, creating the sensation of a second skin. The cut was mathematically precise, every seam flawless. This dress did not scream its price. It whispered. And only those who understood could hear that whisper. To everyone else, including her family, it would just be a simple black dress. The perfect camouflage. She took it off the hanger. The fabric was cool and smooth to the touch. She would try it on later. Right now, she had to finish her work. Returning to the table, she opened another file. These were her personal notes on La Toile d'Or, from her last visit. Chef Lefebvre is a virtuoso of sauces. His veal bone just is a benchmark. Depth, complexity, perfect balance. But there's a problem with the staff. The young sommelier Jean-Pierre tries too hard to please. His speech is rehearsed, lacking confidence. The waitress in section a name? Dropped cutlery twice. The atmosphere is tense. You can feel the fear of the chef seeping from the kitchen into the dining room. It prevents guests from relaxing. The music, faceless jazz, too loud for intimate conversation. The lighting over table number 12 is too harsh. She read and remembered. She recalled the tastes, the sounds, the sensations. This work required total concentration, an almost meditative immersion. She wasn't just an eater. She was an analyst, a psychologist, an observer. She closed the laptop. The article on Vogue Gastronomy could wait until morning. The notes on La Toile d'Or were for the future. Tonight, she would not be working. She would be playing a role. The role of Ellie Thompson. The girl who wore simple dresses because she couldn't afford designer ones. The girl who scribbled in her little notebook out of boredom or insecurity. The girl who needed her successful older sister to pay for her. She walked to the full-length mirror on the inside of the closet door. A woman whose eyes were older than her years looked back at her. A woman who had built herself up, in secret from everyone. She knew the evening ahead would be difficult. It would be full of small barbs, condescending looks, and unsolicited advice. But now she was ready. She wasn't going as a victim to the slaughter. She was going as a scientist into the field to collect data. As a scout in enemy territory. She would wear her simple black dress, take her little notebook, and observe them as dispassionately as she observed the work of waiters and evaluated the acidity of a sauce. And maybe this time, she would find the answer to the question that had plagued her for years. Not why are they like this? But why do I still go back? Maybe she didn't go back for them, but for herself, so that each time she confronted their version of her, she could feel even more keenly who she really was. so that after their fake, noisy world, she could appreciate the silence and authenticity of her own even more. She smirked at her reflection. This smirk was different now, not bitter, but confident, almost predatory. The pseudonym didn't just give her anonymity, it gave her weight. And tonight, for the first time, she felt how pleasant it would be to simply sit at the table, aware of that weight, while no one else even suspected its existence. It was her quiet, unbreakable power. The taxi she had summoned through an anonymous app was an ordinary, unremarkable sedan. The driver was listening to sports radio, and the muffled voice of the commentator, full of feigned enthusiasm, served as the backdrop for her thoughts. Eleanor stared out the window, but she didn't see the flashing storefronts and neon signs. She was looking at her own, barely discernible reflection in the glass, watching as the features of Ellie slowly emerged and superimposed themselves onto the face of Ethel. It was an almost physical process, akin to an actor applying makeup before stepping onto the stage. She consciously relaxed her shoulders, which she instinctively held straight. She slouched slightly, just enough to appear less confident. She wiped the focused expression from her face, replacing it with a mask of polite, slightly bewildered detachment. She had to become the embodiment of everything they expected of her. A pale shadow, a girl adrift, devoid of ambition and drive. The car turned onto a quiet, respectable street, bathed in the greenery of old plane trees. Even the air here seemed different, denser, more expensive. The facade of La Toile d'Or appeared suddenly, as if materializing out of the twilight. It was an old white stone building, restrained yet monumental. No garish signs, just a small, artfully engraved brass plaque with the name and 3 tiny stars beneath it. Tall, arched windows were draped with heavy curtains, shielding the happenings within from prying eyes. The entrance was guarded by 2 massive bronze lions, their manes polished to a shine by thousands of touches. Everything here spoke not of fleeting fashion, but of eternal, unshakable power. This wasn't just a restaurant. It was a temple of success, where her family had come to perform their ritual of self-affirmation. As the taxi pulled up to the entrance, a doorman instantly stepped forward. He was a tall, silver-haired man in an immaculate uniform, his posture speaking of decades of service in the finest establishments. He opened the door with a smoothness and dignity that anticipated a lady in furs or a gentleman in a tuxedo. When Eleanor emerged from the car in her simple black dress, a small clutch in her hand, something akin to confusion flickered across his face for a split second. It was almost imperceptible, like the shadow of a passing bird, but Eleanor, whose senses were heightened to their peak, noticed it. She noticed how his gaze flickered from her modest shoes to her face, how his professional smile momentarily froze. He had been expecting someone else. Her arrival was a small anomaly, a glitch in the familiar pattern of luxury cars and their dazzling passengers. Of course, he immediately composed himself, his face once again becoming an impenetrable mask of politeness. "Good evening, mademoiselle," he said in a low, well-trained voice. "Good evening," Eleanor replied, deliberately making her voice a little softer than usual. She paid the driver and stepped toward the heavy oak doors, which the doorman swung open for her. And in that moment, she crossed a threshold. The air inside was different. It was warm, thick, and permeated with a complex aroma that Ethel could have broken down into its constituent parts. The scent of beeswax from the polished floors, the delicate fragrance of fresh lilies in a huge vase, a subtle hint of expensive cognac, and the clean, starchy smell of freshly pressed linen. The noise of the street vanished instantly, replaced by a quiet, muted hum. A mixture of low conversations, the clinking of silver, and barely audible classical music. It was a transition into another reality, a world where time flowed more slowly, and every gesture was measured and full of meaning. At the entrance to the main dining room, she was met by the maitre d'. He was the complete opposite of the doorman. Young, energetic, with perfectly styled hair, and a suit that fit him like a glove. His eyes held a sharp, appraising shrewdness. He was the true gatekeeper, one who could determine a guest's status and ability to pay with a single glance. He gave Eleanor a quick, professional once-over that nonetheless missed no detail. His smile was flawless, but cold. "Good evening, mademoiselle. Do you have a reservation?" His voice was soft, but there were notes of steel in it. "Good evening." "Yes, under the name Thompson," Eleanor answered, again playing her part. The part of someone who feels a little out of place here. And again she saw it. The microscopic change. Upon hearing the name Thompson, the maitre d' froze for a moment. His brain, working like a high-precision computer, instantly correlated the data. Thompson. Table number 7, the best in the room. Special instructions from Chef Lefebvre himself. A reservation made 8 months ago. An influential family. And this girl. In a simple dress, without jewelry. Arriving in a regular taxi. For a fraction of a second, the same cognitive dissonance that had appeared in the doorman's eyes flickered in his. But he was a top-tier professional. His face immediately smoothed over, the cold smile replaced by a warm and welcoming one. The contradiction had been resolved in favor of the surname. "Ah, yes, of course. Mr. Thompson and his family have already arrived. Please follow me, mademoiselle." He led her across the room. And this walk was a true ordeal for Eleanor. She could feel the gazes of the other guests on her. Not because she was someone special, but for the opposite reason, because she seemed like a foreign element here. She walked past tables covered with snow-white cloths, past women in diamonds and men in expensive watches. The air was saturated with the smells of exquisite food and fine wines. She walked with her eyes lowered, as Ellie should. But Ethel inside her was wide awake. She was scanning everything. She noticed how an elderly man at a window table was holding his Bordeaux glass incorrectly, cupping the bowl with his entire palm and warming the wine. She noticed the panic in the eyes of a young waiter, who nearly tripped over a chair leg. She noticed the bored expression on the face of a beautiful blonde sitting across from a silver-haired gentleman who was enthusiastically telling her something, gesticulating with a fork speared with a piece of lobster. She saw the underbelly of this glittering world, all its hidden drama and comedy. It was her superpower and her curse. And there, in the very center of this gleaming hall, at a large round table, she saw them. Her family. They hadn't noticed her yet. This gave her a few precious seconds to observe them from a distance, as if they were strangers. Her father, Robert Thompson, sat at the head of the table like a king on his throne. His face was red from wine and self-satisfaction. He was telling something loudly, and his laughter rolled over the table like thunder. Her mother, Eleanor, sat with a perfectly straight back, her face a frozen mask of nobility and slight disdain for everything around her. She occasionally adjusted her pearl necklace, a gesture Eleanor knew from childhood meant she was either bored or nervous. And next to her, Vanessa. She was laughing theatrically at her father's joke, tilting her head back to show off her long neck and the sparkle of her earrings. She was in her element, playing the lead role in this performance called The Successful Thompson Family. The maitre d' led Eleanor to the table and with a slight bow announced, "Mademoiselle Thompson." The performance paused for a moment. 3 pairs of eyes turned to her. And in that instant, Eleanor felt as if she were standing under the glare of 3 powerful spotlights. Her mother was the first to react. Her gaze swept over Eleanor from head to toe and back again. A quick, cold scan, assessing every inch. It lingered on her simple dress, her lack of jewelry, her modest clutch. Her face reflected a complex mixture of relief. She hadn't embarrassed them with something garish and tasteless. And faint contempt. She looked poor and predictable. "Oh, Ellie, you made it," she said, her voice devoid of warmth, merely stating a fact. "How nice." "Very modest." The last word was uttered with a barely perceptible pause that turned the compliment into a sentence. Then her father spoke. "Ellie. My girl," he boomed, and several guests at neighboring tables turned their heads. "Finally. We were beginning to think you got lost in that newsroom of yours. Sit, have some wine. You look pale." His joviality was as deafening and false as his laugh. He didn't ask how she was. He was simply stating his own magnanimity in allowing her, the lost sheep, to join the elite flock. And finally Vanessa. She graced her sister with only a fleeting glance. There wasn't even contempt in it, just a slight annoyance, as if a boring and non-essential guest had arrived at the party. "Hi, Ellie," she tossed out and immediately turned to her fiancé Gavin, who was sitting next to her, to whisper something in his ear, after which they both chuckled softly. Eleanor silently nodded to them all and sat down in the only empty chair. which, as she had expected, was in the most awkward spot, between her mother, from whom a chill emanated, and the aisle where waiters were constantly bustling. A waiter immediately rushed over to pour her some wine. She noticed his hand was trembling slightly. The performance resumed. Her father continued his interrupted anecdote. Her mother went back to adjusting her pearls. Vanessa flirted with her fiancé. For them, her arrival had been nothing more than a minor interlude. They had already forgotten about her. And Eleanor sat there in her simple black dress, holding a glass of expensive wine that she was allowed not to pay for, feeling like the loneliest person in this crowded, glittering room. The mask was in place. The show had begun, and she was ready to play her part to the end. From the moment Eleanor sat down at the table, time seemed to split into two separate streams. The first was external, slow and viscous like overheated caramel. It consisted of fragmented conversations, the clinking of glasses, false laughter, and pauses filled with awkwardness. The second stream was internal, swift and sharp as a scalpel. This was the stream of Ethel's thoughts, as she dissected every word, every gesture, every detail of the play unfolding before her with the cold precision of an analyst. The performance began with the discussion of gifts. Her father, leaning back in his chair so that his stomach protruded impressively from under his waistcoat, received the offerings with the air of a Caesar. Gavin, Vanessa's fiancé, presented him with a heavy, polished wooden box, a servile smile plastered on his face. "Robert, happy birthday. This is from Vanessa and me. We thought long and hard about what to give a man who has everything." Inside, nestled on a bed of dark blue velvet, lay a watch. Swiss, of course. It had an enormous dial cluttered with additional scales and buttons. The model was clearly chosen to scream its own wealth. "A Breitling Navitimer," her father declared with satisfaction, holding the watch up to the light. "Good choice, Gavin. A classic. A man's toy." Eleanor smirked almost imperceptibly into her wine glass. She knew the model. It was a popular but rather tasteless version often bought by the newly rich to make an impression. True connoisseurs preferred more understated and rare models. Hidden beneath the long sleeve of her own dress was a Patek Philippe Calatrava, thin, elegant, without a single superfluous detail. It was worth 3 times as much as this Breitling, but only an expert could understand its true value. It was another element of her camouflage. "And this is from Mom and me," Vanessa said, sliding a flat envelope toward her father. "It's a gift certificate for a weekend at the Pebble Beach Golf Club in California. First-class airfare and the best suite at the lodge, of course." Wow. Her father was genuinely impressed. "Now that's what I call style. You're spoiling me, kids." He looked with pride at his eldest daughter and her fiancé. Here they were, his heirs. Successful, generous, understanding what true status meant. Then his gaze, as if reluctantly, slid to Eleanor. A pause descended. Everyone was waiting. "And you, Ellie? What do you have for your old man?" he asked, and his voice held that note of condescending pity she hated so much. He wasn't expecting anything of value. His question was merely a formality, meant to highlight the contrast between his successful children and her. Eleanor slowly set her glass down. She reached into her small clutch and pulled out a similarly flat but utterly unremarkable envelope made of simple craft paper. She handed it to her father. "Happy birthday, Dad." He took it with a slight air of distaste, as if afraid of soiling his fingers. Vanessa craned her neck with curiosity. Her father tore open the envelope and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. It wasn't a greeting card. It was a ticket. A single ticket to a lecture by the renowned historian and architect Jean-Louis Martin, titled The Hidden Gardens of Paris, History and Modernity. The lecture was scheduled to take place at the local university in 2 weeks. Her father stared at the ticket, his face a mask of complete bewilderment. "The Hidden Gardens of Paris?" he repeated, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. "What is this?" "I remember you once said you were interested in the history of landscape design," Eleanor said quietly. "I saw the announcement and thought you might find it interesting. Martin is the leading expert in the field." She did remember. It was many years ago, during one of those rare moments when her father had allowed himself to be himself, not Robert Thompson, head of the family. They were walking in a park, and he had spoken with unexpected passion about the structure of English and French gardens. That conversation had been lost in the depths of her memory, but she had kept it, like a precious jewel. She had spent hours finding this lecture, and had used her connections to get a ticket, as they had all been sold out long ago. It was a gift filled with meaning, attention, and memory. But her family only saw a ticket to a university lecture. Vanessa was the first to laugh. It was a quiet but deeply hurtful chuckle. "Oh, Ellie, that's so sweet. And so you. A ticket to a lecture." "Indeed, very educational," her mother added, but her voice was laced with ice. "But dear, your father is a busy man. He doesn't have time to go to lectures." Her father crumpled the ticket in his fist, then catching himself, awkwardly smoothed it out and shoved it into his jacket pocket. "Thank you, daughter. Very original," he ground out, his face turning crimson again. He was humiliated. Not by the gift itself, but by its failure to match his expectations. He wanted status, and he got a thought. He wanted glitter, and he got substance. The conversation hung awkwardly in the air. To save the situation, Gavin said loudly, "Speaking of Paris, Vanessa and I are planning to fly there for Christmas. We want to stay at the George V. They say the service is the best." It was a life raft, and everyone grabbed onto it. A lively discussion of Parisian hotels, restaurants, and shops began. Eleanor became invisible again. She sat in silence, sipping her wine and making her notes. Not in her notebook, not yet. In her mind. Observation number 1. The currency of value. For her family, value was measured exclusively in monetary units and status markers. A Breitling watch was good because it was expensive and recognizable. A trip to Pebble Beach was magnificent because it was synonymous with luxury. A ticket to a lecture, even an exclusive one of interest to the recipient, was a failure because its nominal cost was negligible. They didn't understand the essence of the gift because they spoke a different language. The language of price tags. The appetizers arrived. A plate of scallop carpaccio with citrus dressing and black caviar was placed before Eleanor. The dish was a work of art. The thinnest, almost transparent petals of scallops were arranged in the shape of a flower. Every drop of dressing, every bead of caviar, was in its own mathematically precise place. Eleanor picked up her fork, speared a single petal, and put it in her mouth. Instantly, Ethel delivered her verdict. The scallops were impeccably fresh, their sweet, oceanic taste clean and bright. But the citrus dressing was too aggressive. The yuzu and lime completely overwhelmed the delicate flavor of the seafood. And the black caviar, though high quality, was entirely superfluous here, added solely for status and to inflate the price. It was a rookie mistake, the kind made by someone trying too hard to impress. Chef Lefebvre must have been overly nervous, knowing who was sitting at table number 7. No, wait, he didn't know Ethel was at the table. He was simply trying to please the important guests. "Divine," Vanessa exclaimed after tasting the same dish. "Can you feel that explosion of flavor? Simply incredible." Her father grunted in agreement, shoveling 3 scallop petals into his mouth at once. Her mother ate with aristocratic slowness, but her face expressed nothing but polite approval. Observation number 2. Ignorance as a form of status. They didn't understand food. They were consuming not flavor, but a brand. L'Etoile d'Or. They weren't analyzing the balance of ingredients. They were reveling in the knowledge that they were eating the most expensive and prestigious food available. Their taste buds had atrophied from disuse. Their delight was as false as their laughter. The conversation shifted to work. Gavin proudly spoke of a major merger deal his bank was handling. "It's a game changer for the market," he proclaimed, waving his knife. "We're going to become monopolists in this sector." Eleanor was only half listening. She knew far more about this deal than Gavin did. She knew that the antitrust committee was already looking into it, and that there was a serious chance the deal would fall through. Her source in government circles, who sometimes supplied her with exclusive information for her second, economics-focused blog under another pseudonym, had told her so. Gavin was sailing on the Titanic and admiring the orchestra. And then, Vanessa decided to strike. She turned to Eleanor with the sweetest of her smiles. "And how are you, Ellie? What's new in the world of journalism?" still writing about bakery openings and lost kittens. It was a direct attack, calculated to humiliate her in front of Gavin and her parents. Eleanor slowly blotted her lips with her napkin. She looked her sister directly in the eye. "The other day, I wrote an article that caused a company's stock to drop by 15%, she said in a quiet, even voice. Silence fell. Vanessa blinked, her smile faltering. "What?" she asked. "Just an analytical piece about their overvalued assets." Eleanor added just as calmly. "It seems the investors agreed with me. So yes, sometimes I write about things more serious than kittens." It was the absolute truth. It was the very article about Vogue gastronomy. She hadn't named the company or the publication, but she had thrown them a crumb of truth to see how they would react. The reaction was predictable. They didn't believe her. Her father let out a hearty laugh, slapping his knee. "What an imagination on this girl. Crashed the stock market. Ellie, you should be writing novels." "Very funny, dear," her mother said, her lips pursed. "You shouldn't make up things like that, not even as a joke." They couldn't imagine she was capable of such a thing. In their worldview, she was too insignificant Ellie, to have any real influence. Her words were dismissed as a ridiculous fabrication. An attempt by a small person to seem bigger than she was. The humiliation had failed, but only because the target was too far beyond their comprehension. It was at that moment that Eleanor took her small black notebook and a pencil from her clutch. She saw her mother tense up, saw Vanessa frown. But she ignored them. She opened to a clean page and made a few short notes. Scallops. Dressing, yuzu/lime. Overpowers main flavor. Caviar superfluous decor/price. Ambience. Table number 7. Tense. Eagerness to please quality. Family. Communication. Transactional. Value equals price. Emotional deafness. She wrote in her special shorthand, a mix of abbreviations, symbols, and keywords. To an outsider, it might indeed look like scribbles. But for her, it was a coherent system. She sketched a diagram of the dish's presentation. She put a question mark next to the word caviar. She was working. And in that moment, she felt invincible. Their world couldn't reach her. She was behind glass in her laboratory, and they were merely the subjects of her study. "Ellie, put that away, please," her mother hissed as a waiter approached to clear the plates. "You're embarrassing us." Eleanor slowly raised her eyes to her. For the first time that evening, she allowed herself to look at her mother not as a daughter, but as Ethel. She saw not her strict mother, but a frightened woman for whom the opinions of others were more important than her own child's feelings. A woman whose life was built on observing rules and rituals, and any deviation from them caused her to panic. And for the first time in years, Eleanor felt not resentment, but something akin to pity. She didn't answer. She simply closed the notebook and placed it next to her plate. The performance continued, and she knew there were still several acts to go. But something had changed. She no longer felt like a victim. She was the director, secretly observing the performance of her actors from a dark corner of the theater. And she knew that the finale of this play would be nothing like what they imagined. Of course. Here is the detailed English translation of Chapter 5, where the tension escalates and the first crack appears in the Thompson family's facade. After the appetizer plates were cleared with a flawless, almost robotic synchronicity, a brief intermission followed. It was that specific pause in a well-orchestrated dinner, designed to allow guests to refresh their palates and continue their sophisticated conversation. For the Thompson family, it was the signal for the second act of the play to begin. The demonstration of their worldliness and connections. And the leading role in this act was always played by the sommelier. Eleanor watched him approach. It was the same young man she had noted in her mental log, Jean-Pierre, if her memory served her right. He was wheeling a small, dark wood trolley before him, upon which sat a decanter, several differently shaped glasses, and a bottle of wine. He moved with an exaggerated caution, as if he were carrying not a bottle, but a fragile artifact from a museum. His face was pale under the harsh light of the chandelier, and a thin film of sweat glistened on his forehead. He was clearly terrified of serving table number 7. He stopped at the table and, with a slight bow, addressed Eleanor's father. Monsieur Thompson, he began, his rehearsed voice trembling slightly, to accompany your main course, the filet mignon with sauce Périgueux, Chef Lefebvre recommends this wine. A 1982 Chateau Margaux. A great vintage, an exceptional terroir, a wine with incredible potential and a complex bouquet. He continued his monologue, listing notes of blackcurrant, cedar, violets, and tobacco, but Eleanor was no longer listening. She was looking at the bottle. It was indeed a 1982 Chateau Margaux, a legendary wine, an icon of Bordeaux. And it was a catastrophe. Not because the wine was bad, it was divine, but because serving it with filet mignon in a rich truffle sauce was a crime. The powerful, layered flavor of the sauce would completely obliterate the subtle nuances of this great, mature wine. It was like using a microscope to hammer a nail. The choice was made not for gustatory harmony, but for a display of status. Look at us, we are drinking the most expensive and famous wine. Her father, of course, was thrilled. Excellent. Chateau Margaux. We know it, we love it, we drink it, he boomed, winking at Gavin. Pour away, young man, don't be shy. And that's when something unexpected happened. Something that disrupted the familiar order of things. The sommelier, according to all canons of wine etiquette, was supposed to pour a small amount of wine for the person who ordered it to taste, in this case her father. It was a sacred and immutable ritual. He took the bottle, his hands trembling slightly, and prepared to pour the wine into Robert Thompson's glass. But at the last second, his gaze darted across the table and settled on Eleanor. She sat quietly, not saying a word, but she was watching. Not like her family, not with anticipation and self-satisfaction. She was watching the bottle, his hands, the glasses. Her gaze was calm but incredibly attentive, piercing. It was the look of someone who sees not the label, but what lies behind it. The look of someone who understands. Perhaps in that moment, something clicked in the young sommelier's mind. Perhaps he remembered the pre-shift briefing where the manager had whispered about rumors of an anonymous critic operating in the city. One who could appear anywhere, anytime. Perhaps he recalled the articles by Ethel that their entire team analyzed in meetings. Articles full of deep knowledge, subtle observations, and ruthless precision. Or maybe it was just instinct, a professional sixth sense that told him that the real power at this table was not seated at its head, but on the side, in a simple black dress. He froze for a fraction of a second. His hand, holding the bottle, faltered and stopped halfway to her father's glass. Then, obeying some internal impulse that was stronger than protocol and the fear of her family, he took a step to the side and extended the tasting glass to Eleanor. Mademoiselle, he asked, and in that single word, all his uncertainty, all his hope, and all his fear resonated. He was placing a bet. He was breaking the rules, risking the wrath of the important guests. But his intuition told him he was addressing the only person at the table truly capable of appreciating his gesture and the wine. A deafening silence fell over the table. Time stopped. Her father froze with his mouth half open, his face slowly beginning to flush. Her mother dug her nails into the armrest of her chair. Vanessa and Gavin exchanged a look of utter bewilderment. The performance had cracked. An element not in the script had suddenly appeared on the meticulously constructed set. Her father was the first to recover. He let out a loud, barking laugh that failed to conceal his fury. A mistake, my friend. A big mistake, he boomed, trying to turn it all into a joke. That's my daughter, Ellie. She knows as much about wine as she does about quantum physics. Give me that glass before it explodes in her hand from sheer surprise. Her father's words struck like a whip. They were humiliating not only for Eleanor, but for the young sommelier as well. He flinched, his face turning white as a sheet. He had made a terrible error. He had insulted the head of the family. He had put himself in the line of fire. He looked at Eleanor with embarrassment, his eyes begging for forgiveness, and then with an apologetic smile he started to step back toward her father. But Eleanor decided to intervene. She didn't do it for herself. She did it for him. For this terrified young man who, alone among everyone in this room, had seen something more in her than just Ellie. One moment, she said. Her voice was quiet, but in the ensuing silence, it sounded clear and authoritative. All eyes turned to her. She slowly reached out and took the glass from the sommelier. Her movements were smooth and confident. She didn't look at her father. She looked at the wine. She held the glass correctly by the stem, as a professional would, and swirled it gently, watching as the dark ruby liquid left thick, oily legs on the side of the glass, a testament to its high alcohol and glycerin content. Then she brought the glass to her nose. Not the way her father did, by crudely shoving his nose into the glass. She held it at a slight distance, first inhaling the initial, most volatile aromas. Then she lowered her nose deeper. She closed her eyes for a moment, completely immersing herself in the complex, layered bouquet. She murmured thoughtfully, as if talking to herself. Interesting. Then she took a small sip. Of course. Here is the detailed English translation of Chapter 6, where the situation escalates dramatically and Eleanor reveals her power. The moment Eleanor closed her eyes, immersing herself in the wine's aroma, the world around her didn't just quiet down, it vanished. The hum of the dining room, her father's tense breathing, her mother's disapproving click of the tongue, even the frightened respiration of the sommelier standing beside her, it all dissolved, receding into the background. All that remained was her and the complex, multifaceted world confined within the fragile walls of the glass. On the first nose, as professionals say, she caught what lay on the surface, aromas of ripe, almost jammy blackcurrant, dark cherry, and a light, barely perceptible hint of sweet plum. This was the wine's facade, its youth which, despite 40 years in the bottle, was still very much alive. Then, dipping her nose deeper, she opened a door to another room, where the tertiary aromas lived, those born from the long process of aging. And this was where the real magic began. She smelled old, well-cured leather, like in a bookbinder's workshop. The scent of a fine cedar cigar box. The subtle fragrance of dry autumn leaves, damp earth after a rain, and mushrooms, the noble forest floor scent of truffle. And somewhere in the far background, like a memory, a delicate, almost perfumed note of wilted violets and dried rose petals pushed through. This was not just a bouquet. It was a story. A tale of the hot summer of 1982, of the terroir of Margaux, of oak barrels, and of the long, dark decades spent in the silence of a cellar. She opened her eyes. Her face was serious and focused. She murmured thoughtfully, as if speaking to herself, but loud enough for everyone at the table to hear. Interesting. Very interesting. Then she took a small, almost microscopic sip. She didn't swallow the wine immediately. She held it in her mouth, chewing it as tasters say, allowing it to wash over all her taste buds. She felt its texture, silky, velvety, with perfectly integrated, almost completely dissolved tannins. The taste was a continuation of the aroma. Blackcurrant and cherry again, but now joined by notes of dark chocolate, espresso, and a light, barely noticeable mineral tang reminiscent of graphite. The finish was incredibly long, changing and evolving, leaving a feeling of warmth and a complex, melancholic sweetness in her mouth. She slowly swallowed the wine and fell silent for a few seconds, listening to her sensations. Then she raised her eyes and looked directly at the young sommelier, Jean-Pierre, who stood holding his breath, looking at her with such hope, as if she were an oracle on whom his fate depended. "The wine is magnificent," she said quietly, but her voice was full of confidence. "You were absolutely right, this is an exceptional specimen. 1982 was indeed a great year for the left bank, and this Chateau Margaux is proof of that. However," she paused and everyone at the table tensed, "to serve it with filet mignon and sauce Périgueux is, forgive me, barbaric." The word barbaric hung in the silent room like a slap in the face. The powerful truffle sauce will completely murder all these delicate tertiary aromas that you have so carefully tried to preserve. This wine demands either quiet meditation on its own, or a very simple accompaniment. Perhaps a piece of aged Parmesan or a few slices of plain, unseasoned roast beef. But certainly not sauce Périgueux. It's a mistake. A big mistake, she finished, almost perfectly echoing her father's phrase, but imbuing it with an entirely different meaning. She turned to the sommelier, who was staring at her with an expression of reverent horror and ecstasy. "It's not your fault," she said gently. "I'm sure it was the chef's directive. Chef Lefebvre is a genius with sauces, but sometimes his passion for bold flavors makes him forget about delicacy. Please tell him that Ethel advises him to trust the product more, and not his desire to impress. And in that moment, she did something she hadn't planned. She said the name that was her shield and her sword, the name she had guarded in secret for years. Ethel. Perhaps her father had provoked her. Perhaps she wanted to reward the young sommelier's courage. Or perhaps she was simply tired. Tired of playing this game, tired of being invisible. At first no one understood. For her family it was just a strange, meaningless sentence. Tell him that some Ethel advises him. They exchanged bewildered glances. But the sommelier Jean-Pierre understood everything. His eyes widened to the size of saucers. He grew even paler, if that was possible. He opened his mouth to say something, but all that came out was a quiet, strangled squeak. He recognized the name that was a legend in their world, the name that was feared and admired. And now he knew to whom he had just, on his own intuition, served a glass of wine for tasting. But the reaction that followed surpassed all of Eleanor's expectations. The kitchen doors at the far end of the dining room burst open with a crash. And into the room, like an enraged bull into an arena, stormed Antoine Lefebvre himself. Chef Lefebvre was a legend not only for his talent but also for his temper. He was known for his fits of rage, his perfectionism that bordered on madness, and the fact that he never, under any circumstances, came out to the dining room to greet guests. He considered it beneath his dignity. His place was in the kitchen, in his fiery kingdom. Now he was striding through the room with quick, determined steps, oblivious to the surprised stares of the guests. His tall chef's hat was slightly askew, and his face was red with anger. He was heading straight for their table. "What is going on here?" he thundered as he approached the table. His gaze was fixed on Jean-Pierre, who looked as if he was about to faint. "Why are you still here? Why has the wine not been served?" "Chef, Mademoiselle." The poor sommelier stammered. And then Eleanor's father, deciding this was the perfect moment to reclaim his shaken authority, chose to intervene. He stood up, puffing out his chest with an air of great importance. "Monsieur Lefebvre, I presume? I am Robert Thompson. There has been a small misunderstanding. Your employee has shown egregious incompetence, but don't worry, I won't complain about him. However, my daughter," he waved a hand in Eleanor's direction, "fancies herself a wine critic and is spouting some nonsense about your wine. Pay her no mind, it's just her hobby, she runs a little food blog." Antoine Lefebvre froze for a moment. He shifted his furious gaze from her father to Eleanor. He looked at her calm face, at the wine glass still in her hand. He looked at her simple black dress and her intense, knowing eyes. He looked at her, and then at the terrified sommelier who was muttering the name, Ethel, under his breath like a prayer. The cogs in the great chef's mind began to turn, connecting the dots with terrifying speed. The little food blog. The name. The impossible knowledge. His face, which had been red with anger, began to drain of color. His jaw went slack. The fiery rage in his eyes was replaced by something else entirely. Something that looked a lot like pure, unadulterated terror. He knew. He stared at Robert Thompson, then at Eleanor, and whispered a single, hoarse word that sealed the fate of everyone at the table. "Blog? Your daughter. Your daughter is Ethel." The word Ethel, whispered by the culinary genius Antoine Lefebvre, did not land like a thunderclap. It was not a shout or an accusation. It fell into the deafening silence of the room like a small, but incredibly heavy stone dropped into the perfectly smooth surface of a lake. And the ripples it created were capable of causing a tsunami. For a few endless seconds, absolute silence reigned in the room. Not the tense silence from before, but a vacuum. It was as if someone had turned off the sound. Conversations at neighboring tables halted mid-sentence. The clinking of forks froze. Even the distant sounds from the kitchen seemed to cease. All eyes in the room, as if on cue from an invisible conductor, turned to table number 7. To the table where the legendary name had just been spoken. Eleanor's father, Robert Thompson, was still standing, an expression of extreme bewilderment frozen on his face. He didn't understand. To him it was just a name. "Ethel? What Ethel?" he boomed, addressing the chef, but his voice no longer held its previous confidence. Something in Lefebvre's expression, in his sudden pallor and reverent horror, indicated that something was happening that was beyond his comprehension. But the others were beginning to understand. Slowly, belatedly, but they were beginning to. The maitre d' at the entrance froze like a statue, his professional smile sliding off his face, leaving only confusion. The waiters, frozen between tables with trays in their hands, exchanged glances of superstitious fear. In their world, the name Ethel was akin to the name of a secret king or a supreme judge. No one knew what she looked like, but everyone knew her power. She was a myth, an urban legend, a boogeyman for bad chefs and a guardian angel for geniuses. And now, according to Antoine Lefebvre himself, this myth was sitting at a table in their restaurant. Lefebvre did not answer Robert Thompson. He ignored him as one would ignore a pesky fly. His gaze was fixed on Eleanor. He took a step forward, then another. He came so close to her that she could have touched his pristine white chef's jacket. His hands, capable of creating culinary masterpieces, were trembling slightly. He, the great and terrible Lefebvre, before whom suppliers and investors trembled, now looked like a schoolboy called to the principal's office. "Madam," he said, and his voice, which usually thundered through the kitchen, was quiet and hoarse. "Madam Ethel, I apologize. For the wine. For the sauce. For everything. It is an unforgivable mistake. I was wrong." He bowed his head. Not just a nod, but a deep, respectful bow. Antoine Lefebvre, whose pride was as great as his talent, was bowing. He was bowing to her daughter. To his daughter Ellie, who ran a little food blog. It was at that moment that it finally dawned on Eleanor's father. Not the full picture, not all the details, but the most crucial, devastating truth. He didn't know who Ethel was, but he saw how Lefebvre was behaving. And he understood that his daughter, his little unsuccessful Ellie, possessed some incomprehensible, terrifying power over this famous and proud man. Robert Thompson's worldview, so simple and clear, where everything was measured by money and position, cracked. He slowly, like an old man, sank back into his chair. His face turned from crimson to an ashen gray. Eleanor's mother, Eleanor, seemed to have stopped breathing. Her hand, clutching her pearl necklace, was frozen. The pearls, which had always been a symbol of her status and imperturbability, now seemed like a noose around her neck. She looked at her daughter as if seeing her for the first time. As if from beneath the familiar, habitual mask of Ellie, the face of a completely unknown, frightening creature had emerged. But the most vivid reaction was Vanessa's. Her beautiful, well-groomed face contorted into a grimace of disbelief, transitioning into panic. She looked from her sister to the bowing chef, then to her fiancé, Gavin, as if seeking confirmation that this was all a bad dream, a ridiculous prank. "What is happening?" she hissed, turning to Gavin. "What does all this mean?" Gavin, who always had an answer for everything, was now just blinking in confusion. He was as bewildered as the rest of them. Eleanor, meanwhile, looked calmly at Lefebvre. She felt no triumph. She only felt a weariness and a strange sadness. She hadn't wanted this. Not like this. Not publicly. "Stand up, chef," she said quietly. "There's no need for this." Lefebvre slowly straightened up but didn't dare to meet her eyes. I will fix it at once, madam," he stammered. "I will personally prepare another dish for you. Something simple. Grilled pigeon. Or just steamed halibut with olive oil. And another wine, of course. I have a 1990 Romani Conti in my cellar." Upon hearing the name of the most expensive and rare wine in the world, Vanessa let out a soft groan. Eleanor raised her hand, stopping him. "Don't, chef. It's all right. I was just expressing my opinion. It's my job." "Your job?" Lefebvre echoed, his voice filled with reverence. And then the silence was broken by a new sound. At the next table, where the silver-haired gentleman sat with his bored companion, an excited whisper arose, loud enough for everyone to hear. "My God, Henry, did you hear? It's Ethel. The Ethel. I told you she was real." The man, addressed as Henry, an elderly banker or industrialist by his appearance, dropped his fork. It clattered against his plate. "Ethel? Here," he whispered, turning towards the Thompsons' table. His gaze, full of respect and curiosity, was fixed on Eleanor. And that was the signal. A murmur rippled through the room. People began to whisper, pulling out their phones, presumably to Google the name. The world beyond their table had woken up and realized what a historic event it was witnessing. The #1 restaurant critic, whose anonymity was as legendary as her reviews, had just been unmasked. And unmasked in the most famous restaurant in the city. Eleanor knew that her anonymity was over. In that very minute. Tomorrow, her face would be in every newspaper and blog. Her life would change forever. And the cause was her own fatigue and the courage of one young sommelier. She turned her head and looked at Jean-Pierre. He was still standing nearby, pale, but his eyes no longer held fear. A fire burned in them. A fire of excitement and devotion. He was part of this event. He was the one who had triggered it. And he understood that from this moment on, his own career would skyrocket. He was the sommelier who had recognized Ethel. Eleanor shifted her gaze to her family. They sat like petrified statues in a wax museum, depicting a scene titled, "The Shattering of Illusions." Her father stared at his plate, as if hoping to find answers there. Her mother had covered her face with her hands. And Vanessa was looking at her. And in her gaze was not just envy or shock. There was pure, unadulterated hatred. Hatred for the sister who had just stolen her world. Her status, her place in the sun. All her life, Vanessa had been the star, the golden girl, and Ellie her pale, unremarkable shadow. And now, in an instant, the shadow had grown and consumed the star. Eleanor took a deep breath. The performance was over. The masks were off. It was time to lower the curtain. She stood up. All movement in the room froze again. "Chef Lefebvre," she said calmly and clearly, addressing not only him but the entire room. "You are a genius. Don't let anyone, least of all yourself, make you doubt that. But tonight, I didn't come here as a critic. I came for my father's birthday." She turned to her family. "Dad, Mom, Vanessa. I'm sorry I ruined your evening. It seems I really don't know how to be normal." She took her small clutch from the chair. Then she did something no one expected. She walked over to her father, who was still staring into space, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Happy birthday, Dad," she said quietly, and for the first time that evening, genuine tenderness was in her voice. "I really did remember about the gardens." Then she turned and walked toward the exit. She walked through the room with her back straight, her eyes forward. She was no longer Ellie. She was Eleanor Thompson. And she was Ethel. And now the whole world knew it. People parted before her like the waters of the Red Sea before Moses. She could hear the clicks of cell phone cameras behind her, but she paid them no mind. At the very door, Chef Lefebvre caught up with her. "Madam," he called out. "Please don't leave. The bill. The bill is on the house, of course. Anything you want." Eleanor turned and looked at him with a faint, sad smile. "Thank you, Chef. But I never dine for free. Send the bill to the editorial office of the Gavel. They'll take care of it." She stepped out into the street. The cool night air hit her face, sobering. She took several deep breaths. It was over. And it was just beginning. She took out her phone. Not to call a taxi. She dialed a number. "Hello, Mark? It's Eleanor." "Yes. It happened. Get the lawyers and the PR team ready. Tomorrow is going to be a fun day." She ended the call and looked at the facade of the restaurant, from whose windows a warm light poured. Inside, her family remained, in the ruins of their small, cozy world. She felt no gloating, only liberation. She had finally cast off the mask she had worn for so many years. And for the first time in a long time, she felt whole and free. As soon as the oak doors of L'Etoile d'Or closed behind Eleanor, the vacuum that had enveloped the room imploded. The air once again filled with sound, but it was a different kind of sound. It was a buzz, like that of a disturbed beehive. Whispers had escalated into lively conversations, and they were all about one thing. The name Ethel flitted from table to table like an exotic butterfly. The people who, just a short while ago, had looked down on the quiet girl at table number 7, were now eagerly discussing every detail. Her simple dress, her composure, her devastating remark about barbarism. They had witnessed history, and everyone wanted to take a piece of it with them. But for the 3 people remaining at table number 7, the world did not return to its normal axis. It had shattered into 1,000 pieces, and they sat amidst the ruins, stunned and blinded. Robert Thompson was the first to emerge from his stupor. But this was not the return of the old, self-assured Robert. This was a man who had been deflated. His pomposity, his booming voice, his regal posture, all were gone. He slowly raised his head and surveyed the room. He saw how people were looking at him. Not with envy, as he was accustomed, not with deference, but with something new, something incomprehensible. A mixture of pity, curiosity, and faint contempt. He was Ethel's father. But he was also the man who had just publicly humiliated her, comparing her knowledge of wine to her knowledge of quantum physics. He was the fool in this drama. What was that? He rasped, addressing no one in particular, but the void itself. His voice, which usually boomed like a trumpet, was now weak and shaky. Eleanor, his wife, finally removed her hands from her face. Her makeup, always flawless, was slightly smudged. A tear track was visible on her cheek. She looked at her husband with an expression he had never seen before. There was no support in it, no sympathy. There was only accusation. "It was you, Robert," she whispered. "It was all you. Your pride. Your blindness. You never saw her. Never. You only saw how she failed to meet your expectations." "Me," he sputtered. "What do I have to do with it? It was her. She deceived us. All these years. Living a double life. Pretending to be a failure. And what else was she supposed to pretend to be?" Eleanor's voice grew stronger, a metallic edge to it. "Herself? So you could laugh at her successes just as you laughed at her gift? So you could devalue everything she achieved because it didn't fit into your worldview? She wasn't deceiving us, Robert. She was protecting herself from us." This dialogue, quiet and venomous, was more terrifying than any shout. The foundation of their 40-year marriage, built on the mutual support of their shared facade, was cracking at the seams. Vanessa, meanwhile, was looking at her fiancé Gavin. She was searching his eyes for support, for an alliance, for confirmation that they were still a team, that they were above all this. But Gavin wasn't looking at her. He was staring at his phone, typing frantically. His face was pale, and a cold sweat had broken out on his forehead. "Gavin," she called. "Gavin, can you hear me?" He looked up at her, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Vanessa, the gavel." He stammered. "I googled it. It's not just a blog. It's the most influential financial and analytical publication online. They call them the Hammers because they destroy companies. Their articles are anonymous. Everyone on Wall Street is afraid of them." He swallowed hard. "That merger deal I was telling you about. Last week, an article came out on the gavel that tore it to shreds. Analysts are predicting the antitrust committee will block it. Our bank could face colossal losses." He looked at Vanessa as if seeing her for the first time. "Her sister, your sister, is she the gavel?" Vanessa's world narrowed to a single point. All her successes, her career, her status as the golden girl. All of it had been built on a foundation of superiority over her sister. She was the smart one, and Ellie was the naive one. She was the successful one, and Ellie was the failure. This contrast was the basis of her self-esteem. And now, that foundation had crumbled to dust. It turned out that while she had been building her little house of cards, her sister had been erecting an impregnable fortress. "That's impossible," she whispered. "It has to be a mistake. She couldn't. She's just Ellie." At that moment, Chef Lefebvre approached their table again. He was no longer enraged or frightened. He was composed and businesslike, like a general after a lost battle, preparing to regroup. He was followed by two waiters with fresh cutlery and glasses. "Monsieur, madame," he addressed Eleanor's parents with a cold, impeccable politeness. "Your dinner will, of course, continue. On the house. We will bring your main courses." He paused, then added with a barely perceptible note of steel in his voice. "However, I must ask that in the future, when booking a table, you specify that you are the family of Madame Ethel. It will help us avoid misunderstandings like this." It was said with perfect correctness, but in essence it was a subtle, sophisticated humiliation. He was speaking to them not as important guests, but as the problematic relatives of a celebrity who had to be tolerated. He was putting them in their place. Robert Thompson's face turned purple. How dare you? I dare, monsieur, Lefebvre interrupted him. Because one review from Madame Ethel can close my restaurant. Whereas your visit, as I now understand, will bring me nothing but trouble. Enjoy your dinner. He turned and walked away, leaving them sitting in a ringing silence. The waiters silently and quickly replaced the cutlery. They brought the main courses. The filet mignon was placed in front of Robert. The very dish that had started it all. He looked at it as if it were his mortal enemy. The aroma of truffle, which an hour ago would have seemed to him the height of luxury, now made him nauseous. But the most devastating blow was yet to come. Another man approached their table. It was Henry Cavendish, the elderly banker from the neighboring table. He was one of those people whose favor Robert Thompson had so craved. They had crossed paths a few times at the golf club, and Robert had always tried to strike up a conversation, but Cavendish had remained cold. Now he approached their table with a broad, friendly smile on his face. "Robert, my dear fellow," he exclaimed, clapping Eleanor's father on the shoulder as if they were old friends. "What a surprise! What an evening! I could never have imagined. Your daughter is the mysterious Ethel." Astonishing. Robert blinked in confusion. "Henry, Listen, old man," Cavendish continued, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I have a business proposition for you. You understand the kind of influence she has. A single word from her can make or break a market. If you could put in a good word for me, arrange a meeting, I wouldn't be in your debt. You understand what I'm saying?" And then Robert Thompson understood. He understood that from now on his own value, his status, his place in this world would be measured not by his own achievements, but by his proximity to his daughter. He was no longer Robert Thompson, head of the family. He was Ethel's father. A petitioner. A middleman. An appendage to her fame. This was worse than contempt. It was the complete annihilation of his identity. He looked at his wife, at his eldest daughter, at her fiancé. They had all seen it. They had all heard it. The masks were well and truly off. Sitting before him were not his admiring entourage, but the witnesses to his humiliation. He slowly pushed away his plate with the untouched filet mignon. "I'm not hungry," he said in a hollow voice. "Let's go home." No one objected. They rose from the table and walked toward the exit, not waiting for dessert. They walked through the room, which was still buzzing with talk about them. They could feel dozens of eyes on them. It was the longest and most shameful walk of their lives. The doorman was waiting for them at the exit. He opened the door for them with the same flawless politeness. But there was no longer any deference in his eyes. There was something new. Something that looked like sympathy. And for Robert Thompson, that was the final straw. He would have preferred hatred. He would have preferred contempt. But not pity. They stepped out into the street. The night air no longer felt cool and fresh. It felt cold and hostile. They stood on the sidewalk, three broken, bewildered people, waiting for the doorman to call them a taxi. Their own luxury cars now seemed inappropriate and alien. The evening that was supposed to be a triumph for their family had turned into a complete disaster. And the cause of it all was the quiet, inconspicuous girl they had considered their biggest failure their entire lives. The taxi the doorman had summoned was a spacious black Mercedes, one of those that idled near expensive restaurants and hotels. On any other evening, Robert Thompson would have noted this fact with satisfaction, as yet another confirmation of his status. But tonight he didn't care. He silently got into the back seat, pressing himself into the far corner, and stared out the window at the passing lights. Eleanor sat next to him, at the maximum possible distance, as if afraid of accidental contact. Vanessa and Gavin took the seats opposite them. The doors closed silently, cutting them off from the world. And they found themselves in a confined space, a hermetically sealed capsule filled with awkwardness, anger, and unshed tears. The driver, an elderly man with an impassive face, glanced at them briefly in the rearview mirror, confirmed the address the doorman had given him, and pulled away smoothly. He was apparently used to driving people after dramatic evenings, because he didn't say a word and didn't even turn on the radio. The silence in the car was almost palpable. It was oppressive, thickening, growing heavier with every meter that separated them from the restaurant. This was not the comfortable, familiar silence that exists between close people. This was the silence of a battlefield after the cannons have ceased firing. A silence in which everyone listened to their own thoughts and fears, and was afraid to hear the thoughts of others. Robert stared out the window, but he didn't see the city. He saw a succession of memories. Here was little Ellie, about 8 years old, showing him her rock collection with a serious face, and he was waving her away, rushing to an important meeting. Here she was as a teenager, telling him about a book she had read with shining eyes, and he was nodding along, thinking about stock prices. Here she was as a graduate, talking about her dream of becoming a writer, and he was unleashing all his fury and disappointment upon her in response. He had spent his whole life building his empire, his dynasty, and had measured his children's success by their conformity to his plans. Vanessa was his perfect project. And Ellie was a flaw, a part that didn't fit. And he had simply set her aside, in a distant drawer, occasionally taking her out to sigh about her lack of fortune. And now it turned out that this flawed part was the main mechanism, that while he was building his sandcastle, she had been erecting a skyscraper. He didn't just feel like a fool. He felt robbed. She had stolen his right to be proud of her. She hadn't given him the chance to become the father of a great critic, because he himself had refused to be the father of an ordinary girl who loved to read. A bitterness mixed with shame gnawed at him from the inside. Eleanor stared straight ahead, at the back of the driver's head. Her thoughts were elsewhere. On high society. On her friends, the wives of men as successful as Robert. On tomorrow. She could already imagine the phone calls. Eleanor, darling, is it true? What a sensation. We had no idea. Why did you hide it? They would speak to her with admiration, but behind that admiration would be a hidden glee, because she, Eleanor Thompson, the epitome of taste and tact, had been completely ignorant about her own daughter. She had been blind. All these years she had boasted of Vanessa's successes while speaking of Ellie with pity, when in fact, the opposite was true. She had made a fool of herself. Her flawless reputation was destroyed, and it wasn't Ellie who had destroyed it. It was her own pride and snobbery. She hadn't been a mother, but a social status manager for her family, and she had failed at her job. Vanessa, unlike her parents, was not indulging in reflection. A rage was boiling inside her. Pure, searing like acid. She looked at her hands, clenched into fists. On her finger, the engagement ring with its huge diamond, a gift from Gavin, sparkled. An hour ago, it had seemed to her a symbol of her triumph. Now it looked cheap. All her achievements, her partnership at the firm, her expensive outfits, her fiancé with his prospects. All of it had turned to dust compared to what Ellie had. Ellie had real power. Not bought, not inherited, but earned. The power of intellect, talent, and character. The kind of power that couldn't be faked or purchased. And the worst part was that Ellie wasn't gloating. She hadn't tried to humiliate them. She had played her role until the very end. She had even apologized as she left. And that quiet strength of hers, that dignity, infuriated Vanessa more than anything. If Ellie had screamed, cried, accused, that would be something to fight against. But she simply was. And her very existence was now a reproach to Vanessa. She remembered how she had laughed at Ellie's gift. A ticket to a lecture. How foolish and superficial that had been. Ellie had given their father a thought, a memory, and they had given him expensive trinkets. And now Vanessa understood that her entire life was just a collection of such expensive trinkets, devoid of meaning and substance. Gavin was the only one in the silence who was actively doing something. He didn't look up from his phone. He was reading. Reading Ethel's articles, finding mentions of the gavel in the business press, reading investor forums. And with every new page, his face grew darker. He understood the scale of the catastrophe. Ellie wasn't just a restaurant critic. The gavel, under various pseudonyms, published analysis on all sectors of the economy. It was a shadow empire built on information. And his future sister-in-law, apparently, was its head. He looked at Vanessa. At her beautiful, but now angry and bewildered face. Their future, which had seemed so cloudless, was now in question. His career at the bank, his position. It all depended on a deal that had essentially been destroyed by his fiancée's sister. He felt like a pawn in someone else's incomprehensible game. She knew, he suddenly said into the silence. Everyone started and looked at him. Knew what? Vanessa asked sharply. About the deal. She knew it would fail. The article that destroyed everything came out last week. She knew about it when we were sitting at the table, and I was bragging. She sat there and knew. And said nothing. His voice held not anger, but a kind of superstitious fear. Of course she said nothing. Vanessa exploded. She was enjoying it. Enjoying our humiliation. Sitting there listening to us, and laughing to herself. That little hypocritical. Stop it, Vanessa, Robert said suddenly, his voice quiet but firm. It was so unlike him that everyone fell silent. He turned and looked at his eldest daughter. She wasn't enjoying it. If she wanted to humiliate us, she would have done it long ago, and she would have done it much more painfully. Do you have any idea how many times she could have destroyed us? Gavin and his bank, your law firm, which I'm sure is dependent on her in some way, my own business affairs. She held all the strings and we never even suspected. No. She wasn't enjoying it. She was sparing us. This admission from her father, from a man who never admitted his mistakes, was like an explosion. Vanessa stared at him with her mouth open. Sparing us? Dad, are you out of your mind? She ruined our evening. She made a laughingstock out of all of us. We made laughingstocks out of ourselves. Robert retorted. When we laughed at her gift. When we told her she couldn't afford dinner. When you, he pointed a finger at Vanessa, called her work writing about kittens. We were blind, pompous idiots. And she just got tired. The car turned onto their street and pulled up smoothly in front of their enormous, illuminated mansion. The house, which had always been a symbol of his success to Robert, now seemed like just a big, empty and cold box. The driver stated the fare. Gavin, as if on cue, reached for his wallet, but Robert stopped him. I'll pay. He pulled a wad of cash from his pocket and, without counting, handed the driver several large bills. Keep the change. They got out of the car and walked silently toward the house. Each was lost in their own thoughts. But one thought was shared. The evening was not over. The hardest conversation was yet to come. They entered the vast, marble-floored hall. The echo of their footsteps resounded hollowly in the silence. No one dared to turn on the main light. They went into the living room, where embers glowed in the fireplace, and silently sat down in armchairs, like four strangers in a doctor's waiting room, awaiting a terrible diagnosis. Vanessa was the first to break. I can't believe this, she said, shaking her head. What are we going to do now? What will I tell people at the firm? What will Gavin say at his bank? Our life, it's ruined. Your life? Robert scoffed bitterly. Don't exaggerate, daughter. Your life is just beginning. Mine, on the other hand, seems to be over. Do you even understand what happened? Henry Cavendish. He asked me to arrange a meeting for him with Ellie. Not with me. With her. He saw me not as a partner, but as a secretary. A servant. All my life I built my name, my authority. And in one evening, she ground it all to dust. Now I'm not Robert Thompson. I'm just Ethel's father. He buried his face in his hands. The huge, strong, powerful man now looked small and pathetic. At that moment Eleanor, who had been silent until then, stood up. She went to the bar, poured herself a small amount of cognac, and took a large gulp. Stop feeling sorry for yourself, Robert, she said harshly. Yes, it's humiliating. Yes, it's painful. But you brought this on yourself. And I'm to blame too. We are all to blame. We overlooked the most important thing we had. We overlooked our own daughter. And now we have to live with it. The question is not what we are going to do. The question is, what is she going to do? They all fell silent, pondering her words. What would Eleanor do? Would she publish a devastating review of La Toile d'Or? Would she write about her family's behavior in her next article? Would she use her power to take revenge on them for years of humiliation? They realized that for the first time in their lives, their fate was not in their own hands. It was in the hands of the quiet, modest girl they had never taken seriously. And that was the most terrifying realization of all. They were helpless. And they deserved it. While her family was drowning in silence and mutual accusations on the way home, Eleanor stood on a street corner several blocks from L'Etoile d'Or. She didn't call a taxi. She needed to walk. She needed to feel the solid asphalt under her feet, to breathe in the cool, damp night air mixed with the smells of exhaust fumes and decaying leaves. She needed to return to the real world after the surrealism of the last few hours. The city was living its ordinary nightlife. Cars sped by. The windows of closed shops glowed, and the muffled sounds of music and laughter drifted from a bar on the corner. None of these people knew what had just happened. No one knew that the myth had ceased to be a myth. To them, she was just a woman in a black dress standing on a corner. And this anonymity, which an hour ago had been her armor, and in a few hours would become an unattainable luxury, now felt like a precious, fleeting gift. She had finished her brief, businesslike conversation with Mark, her editor-in-chief and the only person who knew her by sight. He was in shock, but as always, remained a professional. He was already setting the mechanisms in motion. Lawyers were preparing statements on the protection of her privacy. The PR department was drafting an official press release. The war for control of her story had already begun. Putting her phone back in her clutch, she walked down the street, aimlessly, just to be moving. Her heels clicked quietly on the pavement, marking the rhythm of her thoughts. She had expected to feel triumph, schadenfreude, the satisfaction of finally putting her family in their place. But there was none of that. Inside there was a strange, echoing emptiness, mixed with a deep, almost existential sadness. She hadn't wanted this exposure. For years, she had built her anonymity like a medieval monarch building castle walls. It wasn't just a whim. It was the condition of her professional integrity. Now that wall was demolished. Tomorrow morning, when the news broke, every chef in the city would know her face. Every maitre d' would greet her with an obsequious smile. The food she would be served would never again be the same as what was served to ordinary customers. They would try to please her. They would fear her. Her job, in the form she had known and loved it, was over. She herself, with her own hands, had killed Ethel. And for what? To prove something to her family? To people who had been deaf to her for decades? She replayed the scene at dinner in her mind. The young sommelier's gesture. Her father's fury. Her own response, which had escaped almost by accident. She realized it hadn't been a planned act of revenge. It had been an act of exhaustion. The breaking point had been reached. The spring that her family had been compressing for years had finally snapped back. And now she had to live with the consequences. She stopped at the window of a small antiquarian bookshop. In the dim light, she could see rows of old books in worn leather bindings. It reminded her of her gift to her father. The ticket to the lecture on gardens. Such a foolish, naive attempt to reach out. An attempt to say, "Dad, I hear you. I remember. I love you." And in return, she had received only laughter and contempt. And perhaps that had been the final straw. Not the humiliation of herself, but the humiliation of her feelings for him. She took out her phone. Her fingers dialed a number on their own. Not Mark's. It was a number she hadn't dialed in a very long time. The number of her personal assistant, who managed her schedule under the Ethel pseudonym. "Yes, madam." A sleepy but businesslike voice answered. "Ben, hello. I'm sorry it's late. I have a request. The review of L'Etoile d'Or. It has to be published tomorrow morning. As a special edition." "Of course, madam. Do you have the text ready?" "No," Eleanor said. "I'll dictate it to you now. Are you ready to write?" She sat down on a cold stone bench by the shop window. The street was almost deserted. In the ensuing silence, her voice was steady and clear. And she began to dictate. This was not the review she would have written yesterday. And not the one she would write tomorrow. This was a review born of this evening. She began with praise. With surgical precision, she described the genius of Lefebvre's sauces, the impeccable quality of the ingredients, the technical perfection of his dishes. She paid tribute to his talent, calling him one of the greatest chefs of his generation. Then she moved on to criticism. She mentioned the overly aggressive dressing in the scallop carpaccio, calling it an attempt to gild the lily. She wrote about the tense, nervous atmosphere in the dining room, which prevented one from enjoying the food. And finally, she came to the main point. The wine. But the biggest mistake of the evening, she dictated, staring into the darkness, was not culinary but philosophical. Serving the great 1982 Chateau Margaux with a powerful truffle sauce dish is not just a pairing error. It is a symptom of a deeper disease that has afflicted modern fine dining. A disease whose name is the worship of status. In the pursuit of impression, of price, of prestige, the restaurant has forgotten the most important thing, harmony. It has forgotten the soul of the product. It has chosen the loud, vulgar scream of wealth over the quiet, intelligent whisper of taste. And therein lies its tragedy. L'Etoile d'Or is a technically flawless restaurant with enormous potential. But it does not yet have a soul. It dazzles, but it does not warm. It impresses, but it does not move. She paused. Ben, did you get that? Yes, madam. Verbatim. Good. Now the conclusion. The rating. She fell silent for a few seconds, making a decision. This was her last review as an anonymous critic. Her farewell address. Her verdict. The rating, 2 stars. 2. Ben asked in surprise. Everyone had expected L'Etoile d'Or to easily get 3 stars from Ethel. Yes, 2. With a note. With hope for a 3rd, when the chef finds the courage to be simpler. And one more thing. After the rating, in a separate paragraph, write the following. P.S. This review is the last to be written by the critic under the pseudonym, Ethel. The publication The Gavel thanks its readers for their trust. The future of the project will be announced at a later date. She hung up. It was done. She had delivered her verdict not only on the restaurant, but on her past life. She had closed that door. She had killed Ethel to allow Eleanor Thompson to be born. She sat on the bench for a long time, looking at the empty street. The sadness hadn't gone away, but a new feeling had mixed with it. A feeling of lightness. As if for many years she had been carrying a heavy, invisible burden on her shoulders, and now she had thrown it off. The burden of anonymity, the burden of a double life, the burden of family expectations. It was all in the past. What would happen tomorrow? There would be a storm. The media would go crazy. Her family. She didn't want to think about her family. That was a wound that would take a very long time to heal. But for the first time in many years, she felt ready for the future. For any future. Because she was no longer hiding. Not from the world, not from her family, not from herself. She stood up and started walking towards her home. She walked slowly, but confidently. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew one thing. She would never again let anyone tell her who she was. Not her family, not the chefs, not the whole world. From now on, she would write her own story, under her own name. And that was the greatest victory of this crazy, terrible, and ultimately liberating evening. The curtain had fallen on the old play, but somewhere backstage, a new one was already beginning, and she was its main author and director. Waking up the next morning, Eleanor didn't remember anything for a few blissful seconds. Soft morning light filtered into her bedroom. Birds chirped outside the window, and the world seemed just as it had always been. And then it all came rushing back like a tsunami. The restaurant, the wine, the bowing Lefebvre, the name Ethel spoken aloud, the stunned faces of her family, the final farewell call to Ben. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and a strange, intoxicating excitement. She had done it. She had burned all her bridges behind her. She reached for the phone on her bedside table, already knowing what awaited her. The screen was nearly white with notifications. Hundreds of missed calls from unknown numbers. Thousands of messages in messengers and on social media accounts she had never publicly linked. Somehow they had found her. Dozens of emails to an old, almost forgotten university email address. The world knew her name, and now that world was breaking down her door. She ignored it all. She was only interested in one thing. She opened the website for The Gavel. And she saw it. Her last article. It was on the front page, under a huge screaming headline. L'Etoile d'Or, brilliance without a soul. A farewell from Ethel. She read the text she had dictated in the night, sitting on a cold bench. Now, in the light of day, it seemed even sharper and more final. This wasn't just a review. It was a manifesto. And her postscript, her statement of departure, was like an explosion. She opened the comments. There were already thousands. Ethel, don't go. We need you. 2 stars? Lefebvre must be furious. Who is she? Does anyone know what she looks like? My source says it's Robert Thompson's daughter. The industrialist. Unbelievable. That explains why she's so good with economics. The gavel isn't just about food. The news had already spread. Her anonymity, which she had guarded so carefully, had evaporated. She expected to feel panic, regret. But instead, she felt a strange calm. No more hiding. No more lying. The mask had been ripped off, and underneath was her own face. And she liked that face. She got out of bed and went to the mirror. The same woman as yesterday looked back at her, but something had subtly changed. The chronic weariness and sadness were gone from her eyes. In their place was clarity, resolve. She was no longer a secret agent behind enemy lines. She was a queen who had emerged from her castle to rule openly. The phone rang. This time, it was Mark. Are you ready? He asked without preamble. Ready, she replied. There are already paparazzi camped outside your building. About 20 of them. I've sent a car with security for you. It's waiting in the underground garage. Come straight to the office. We need to come up with a plan of action. She took a shower, got dressed. Not in a simple black dress like yesterday. She chose a perfectly tailored ivory pantsuit and a simple silk blouse. These were not clothes for camouflage. These were clothes for power. She didn't hide her Patek Philippe watch. She decided to accept her new reality. She fastened it on her wrist so that it was visible. It was no longer a secret. It was a part of her. Descending to the underground garage, she saw a black armored sedan and 2 sturdy men in severe suits. One of them opened the door for her. Good morning, Miss Thompson. Miss Thompson. Not Madame Ethel. She liked the sound of it. At the office of the gavel, located in an anonymous building in the city's business district, the entire senior staff was already waiting for her. Lawyers, PR specialists, department editors. When she entered the conference room, everyone stood up and applauded. It was so unfamiliar and strange that she was momentarily flustered. She was used to being invisible. Mark, a silver-haired, energetic man who had been her mentor and partner from the very beginning, hugged her. You gave us a fun night, boss, he said with a smile. But that was powerful. Very powerful. They spent several hours in the meeting. They discussed legal aspects, media strategy, the future of the publication. What will you do next? Mark asked. Ethel is dead. But Eleanor Thompson is alive. And now the whole world knows who she is. I'll keep writing, she answered without hesitation. But not just about restaurants anymore. I'll write about how the world works. About power, about money, about illusions. Under my own name. The gavel will become more personal. It will be my voice. The decision was made. It was a new stage. Dangerous, unpredictable, but the only right one. When she left the office late that evening, the world had already changed. Her face was on all the news sites. Her story was the main topic of the day. Mysterious Ethel turns out to be heiress to industrial empire. Critic who held restaurateurs in fear is daughter of tycoon Robert Thompson. The headlines were foolish and superficial, but it didn't matter. The main thing was that the truth was out. She had several messages from her family on her phone. A short, bewildered call me from her father. A long, rambling message full of remorse and pleading from her mother. And not a single one from Vanessa. Eleanor didn't reply. It was too soon. The wounds were too fresh. She knew that this conversation would happen sooner or later, but not now. First, she had to figure things out for herself. She arrived home. The paparazzi were still camped outside, but security escorted her through a back entrance. Entering her quiet, cozy apartment, she felt she had returned to her harbor. But it was no longer a fortress in which she hid. It was her command post. She poured herself a glass of wine, a simple, inexpensive but honest Sauvignon Blanc from the Loire Valley. She sat down at her oak table, opened her laptop, and created a new document. At the top of the page she typed, Chapter 1. And below it, by Eleanor Thompson. She smiled. The victory wasn't in humiliating her family. The victory wasn't in proving something to the world. The victory was in this simple act. in having the right to put her real name on her own story. She didn't know what would happen next. Would she ever forgive her parents? Would she be able to mend her relationship with Vanessa? How would her work and her life change now that she was a public figure? All of this was unknown. But sitting in the silence of her apartment, with a glass of wine in her hand, looking at the blank page ready to receive her words, she felt not fear, but freedom. She had walked through fire and come out the other side, changed. She was no longer a victim of circumstances or others' expectations. She was the master of her own fate. The evening that had begun with a cold invitation ended with a winner's departure. But this was not the kind of winner who stands on a podium, showered with ovations. This was the quiet, internal triumph of a person who had found the strength to be herself. A person who had cast off a mask and found her true face. And that was more precious than all the Michelin stars and all the fortunes in the world. It was a victory that no one could ever take away from her. The curtain had fallen, but Eleanor Thompson was ready to begin a new play. And this time, she was playing the lead role, no longer hiding in the shadows.